One of the things that made me optimistic was the story you relayed of you and John McCain. You're a Democrat and a Republican, a prisoner of war and a war protester, yet you forged a special relationship to opponents. Could you share that with us?
Sure. It's a wonderful story, to be honest with you. It's an affirming story because it's really about our country. It's about how democracy and bipartisanship should work. And I devote a whole chapter to the part about John McCain and our joint quest to deal with Vietnam. But look, obviously, folks, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to know that John McCain, son of an admiral, grandson of an admiral, graduate of Annapolis, went into the Navy as a sense of duty and responsibility, and went to Vietnam and was shot down in 1967. And he spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi in a prison camp. I, son of an Army Air Corps pilot, and a mother who worked in France as a nurse and escaped the Germans right in front of them the day before they came into Paris, and I write about it, and whose house that she lived in France was taken over by the Germans and then bombed and burned when they left it at the end of the war. And I went into the service along with friends of mine at university because I believed in sense of duty. I believed that people who were given a lot owed a lot. You have to serve. And so I volunteered in 1965, raised my hand a year before I graduated even, and decided to go in and volunteered to go to Vietnam. So John and I came to service from the same place, but we had different experiences. And my experience was in the rivers of the Mekong and a gunboat, and his experience was in the air and he shot down. So I get to the Senate in 1984. I'm elected during the Reagan landslide. Reagan carried Massachusetts. And John McCain was in the House, and he came to the Senate, I think, 2 years later or so. We are flying together as members of a delegation to go to Kuwait the day after it was liberated, Desert Storm. And we're sitting, by seniority, we're assigned facing each other in an airplane for hours. And you sit there and think, well, okay, maybe we should talk. So I reached out and said, asked him questions about Annapolis and about service and being a prisoner of war. And he asked me questions about the war I'd experienced and why I'd protested and what I thought. And you know what happened, folks? That conversation brought two people from a different place, the POW and the protester, to say, we should work together. Because we knew that in America, the war had not been pacified. People were still angry. Frankly, some of that anger you saw come out in 2004. I mean, people were still carrying a sense of, whoa, So John and I made a commitment not just to work to make peace with Vietnam and deal with the issue of POW MIA. We felt a mutual obligation to get the answers to the question of whether or not Americans were left behind in Vietnam. And you remember Rambo, so that's Sly Stallone and the movies and the tiger cages. There was a belief system here. A lot of people thought, wow, maybe some guys were left behind. So before you could do anything with Vietnam or anything here at home, you really have to get the answers to that, right? So John and I buckled down and worked together to make peace at home as well as abroad. And it was one of the great things we both did in the Senate. I went to visit John a couple months, 6 weeks before he died. And we laughed about it, we chatted about it a little bit. And we both realized how proud we were of what that committee did, of what we were able to do. Because we went back to Vietnam. I went back 20 times, 25 times. I met with the leaders of Vietnam. I said, guys, we have to go into your hamlets. We have to go into prisons unannounced. We have to be able to talk to your generals, talk to your jailers. We have to be able to chase every bit of evidence because we've got to help those families get answers as to what happened to their loved ones. And so I thought, I thought I'd share. Can I read? I'll share a passage with you folks, which describes in the end, I mean, I can't tell you how hard it was to do this. And at the very end, I had to go to the president of Vietnam, the chairman of the Communist Party, and the prime minister, And I had to say to them, one of our senators is convinced that some Americans may be held under the tomb of Ho Chi Minh. And Mr. President, you need to allow me and that senator to go down under the tomb and look and make certain there's nobody there. I saw him, literally almost turn literally white and look at me, you what? And so I talked to them, I said, look guys, this may seem improbable to you, but it adds to the conspiracy theory and it adds to the doubts. And if you say no, it will make it even stronger, the belief that, and then all our work is for naught. So they okayed it, and Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire and I flew back to Vietnam, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, so nobody could see us, they took us down into the under part of the thing, and Bob was opening doors and shutting doors and walking into corridors, literally looking for whether an American or any trace of the Americans were left alive. And I was transfixed underneath, looking at these machines that were all pumping formaldehyde through Ho upstairs, where he was lying in perpetual state. And I thought, how improbable is this scene, folks, for a guy who was here fighting? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But here's what John McCain and I were proud of. Page 200 in the book. No country in history, in all of warfare, has ever done as much to implement an exhaustive accounting of all the missing and captured in a war. The American people can be proud of what our teams accomplished and continue to accomplish in this endeavor. Most Americans are simply unaware that even today, we have American military personnel who continue to search in Vietnam. We still dig up the crash sites of a C-130 or Phantom jet. We still climb to remote mountaintops and excavate the earth in a rice paddy or village. On one visit to Vietnam, I was taken out to a lush green field near a small farm. There, a complex scaffold of wood had been built leading down a ramp into the excavated area of a downed C-130 that had crashed and never been recovered. I walked into the area and had an eerie feeling that I was literally walking into the crew's resting place, their grave. God had buried them in the very place they had died, but we were finally going to bring them home. I wondered about the circumstances of their loss, whether they were killed before impact or whether there was time for terror or panic as they plummeted to earth. Had anyone survived for a while? Did the plane hit with such an impact that it drove itself 20 feet below the surface we were walking on? Inside the excavation, the troops working painstakingly to sift the earth and scrape away time, explaining to me how they managed their own emotions and performed the difficult task of recovering the fragments of what was once a vibrant, determined team of young Americans at war. I was amazed by the meticulous archaeology methodology of finding scraps of clothing, a tooth, a fragment of a bone, and then undertaking the extraordinary forensic investigation in our labs in Hawaii to make positive identification. This enormous commitment to keep faith with American military values has produced a remarkable record. The remains of more than 700 service members brought home to still mourning families who all deserved answers. This work was one of those rare chances you get in public life to actually bring people something they'd waited for more than 2 decades: peace. The peace that comes with closure. But for me and for John McCain, that wasn't the only reward. In our new friendship and in the work we did, we were ending the war about the war. If a protester and a prisoner of war can find common ground on the most divisive of issues, finding common ground on almost anything else didn't seem so hard after all. That's why I'm an optimist, folks. We can do this.
I love the way you spoke about your dad in the book and John McCain's father. You start your book as you're losing your father, recounting his last satisfying bite of of Swiss chocolate, whispering the word wonderful. You called him Pa and said he was the one that sparked your interest in foreign policy. How so?
Well, my dad was a complicated guy. How many sons haven't said that about their fathers? He very intelligent, thoughtful, but his father, and I write about it, his father took his own life when my dad was 6 years old. And my dad, at 6, I mean, God only knows what you think or feel, and I never got him to really lay all of that out. I tried a few times, but I think the World War II generation, many of your parents, mine, were kind of stoic and, you know, tight-lipped and not as, they didn't discuss as much as we all do, I think, in most places nowadays. So, you know, he went off. My grandmother took, well, my father's older sister, Millie, became very ill she had polio. She got polio a year later after father had died. And so my grandmother took them off to Europe to various spas to try to find a cure. And my grandfather had been a successful businessman. He left enough money for the family to live well. Not rich, but live well, very comfortably. And she searched around Europe. This is the early beginning of the 20s, most of the 20s. They were cavorting around Europe. So my dad was plunked in a school in Vienna first, and then in Switzerland, learned German, got by, and then came back and went to Phillips Andover Academy. And from Andover Academy went to Yale, and from Yale went to Harvard Law School. And from there became a part in early law work in a big firm in Boston until public service drew him to Washington. He went down, he was a counsel in the Navy Department. Then he went into John Foster Dulles' expansion of the State Department in the 1950s, which is when we all went to Europe, and he was a diplomat. He started out as the legal advisor to the High Commissioner of Germany, who was the former president of Harvard, and while Berlin was the center of great focus in the Cold War. So I was a Cold War kid who got plunked off to school in Switzerland. I didn't know where Switzerland was. I didn't know where my school was. I was so homesick for 3 weeks or more. I mean, it was beyond belief. And my parents sort of plunked me down because that's what you do. And they'd both been taught and raised abroad. So there I was in school in Switzerland at age 11 and a half. I get a letter with a bunch of instructions for how I get to Berlin. I get on a train near the school. I go from the school to Montreux, to Lausanne, to Basel, to Zurich, to Basel. I change trains in Zurich.
You were 11
at 11 and a half, 12 years old, following my instructions. Absolutely. Wearing my high socks and shorts, a gray flannel suit, my thin tie, prim and proper. Back then, folks, people got dressed up to travel. Now everybody wears their pajamas. It's a whole different deal. I swear to God, sweats or pajamas, that's the way people go. So I got to Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, I'd go to the PX, because it was a military base at the station, and I'd report in, get my ticket, and go on the special American train that take you through the East Sector to Berlin, because the Russians controlled the East Sector. And I bought a 6-pack of Pepsi, a lot of comic books, stayed up all night, sat with the courier who had a valise, had a padlock to his leg, asked him all kinds of questions. You know, probably lied to me about all the things, but he's the most important guy in the military at that point. And you arrive in Berlin, and guess what? The Army band is there playing Stars and Stripes, and John Philip Sousa marches, and you get off and you feel the proudest person in the world. You're there, in the United States of America, in Berlin, which had such a history in the war. It's it's an amazing story. Nobody does that kind of thing very much anymore. But, so my dad, just by naturally, I was imbued with a sense of policy and what's going on in Berlin. In fact, I learned very abruptly what's going on in Berlin, because I loved to bike. Way back then as a kid, I loved to bike. I still bike, famously. Maybe I should say infamously, notoriously. And so I bike, and I used to bike through the Grunewald in Berlin all the time. And one day I was biking down by the burnt-out Reichstag. Everything was still bombed out, folks. This is early 1950s. It hadn't been rebuilt, and the Reichstag was completely burned out. And I biked down by the Brandenburg Gate and over to Hitler's bunker, which I could see jutting up out of all the cement and blocks that had been blown up were there. And one day I got adventuresome. I had a diplomatic passport as a dependent, and I presented myself at Checkpoint Charlie and rode into East Berlin. And I felt immediately this darkness. Everything was gray and black, and the people dressed dankly, and very few of them, very few cars. And I sensed, just my 12-year-old then sense was, I don't like this. There's something here that's not right, not nice. And I got out of there. I spent 15 minutes, half an hour max, and I went back and came in, and I told my parents, hey, I went into the East Sector today, it was great. My dad, you what? You could have been an international incident, man. You could have disappeared. So I was grounded, lost my passport. That was that vacation. But it was one of the great adventures of all time. And it taught me, it gave me a curiosity about life and about policy. And then he taught at the NATO Defense College. He wrote a book called Star Spangled Mirror about foreign policy, about how we don't see things properly through the eyes of other people in other countries, and that stayed with me for a lifetime.
And you talk a lot about your mother, how she influenced you to become an ardent environmentalist. She's a very special person.
Yeah.
How did she do that? What was your experience
Well,
there?
she did it by example, and she did it by conversation. And my mother, just a quick background on my mother. My mother was the daughter of a old Boston family. Had been involved in the China trade, and going back to my great-great-great-grandfather 8 times over, it was John Winthrop, the first governor of the state of Massachusetts of Commonwealth, and the fellow who wrote the famous sermon on the Arabella that came over in the 1630s that is quoted by Reagan and quoted by Kennedy. We shall be as if a city upon a hill, which actually comes from the Bible, comes from Scripture. But it was famously quoted. He delivered that sermon. And so my mother was living the expatriate life in the sense that my grandfather was involved in business. He was a successful businessman working in France and England, which is why he was there at the beginning of the war. So my mother was born in Paris, American, but born in Paris, and raised between England and France during this period of time. And she felt a sense of responsibility about the war. She went to Paris, learned how to be a nurse. She was working in Montparnasse Station as a nurse, caring for the wounded and the refugees coming in. When they learned the Germans are going to march into Paris tomorrow, you got to get out of here. And her sister had married a Frenchman and didn't have an American passport, so it was particularly important for her to get out. And they took their bicycles, left Paris on bicycles, foraged across France, dodging airplanes and so forth, got to Portugal, and she eventually came back to the United States by ship, where she'd already met my father, who'd been over there in the summer, but they reunited in America and got married, and here I am. But my mother was really amazingly committed. She'd met Lord Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And she was a Girl Scout leader for 50 years, my mother. She believed in Girl Scouting. She was my den mother when I was a Cub Scout. She was my sister's leader as a Girl Scout, Brownie, and then Girl Scout. And, I remember going door to door selling. I don't write about this in the book, about selling Girl Scout cookies, with my sister.
Really, your mother also, you talk about her being able to identify birds by just listening to them.
She was a great bird watcher. My mother was one of the original gray-haired, white-haired, sweater-clad, tennis-sneakered, engaged citizens, folks, if you know the type. And my mother famously, when I was speaking to 1 million people from the steps of the Capitol at the end of the week that we spent as veterans demonstrating in Washington, on Saturday, we vets had cleared out, and the larger demonstration came to Washington, but I was asked to speak, and I spoke at it. My mother had driven down for the greater demonstration, not for mine, but for the bigger one. And she couldn't see me. She wanted to see where I was speaking from. And she saw this tree nearby, so she climbed the tree. and it turns out that had a major impact on her life, our lives, because that night we had made an arrangement to all meet at a restaurant in Georgetown on M Street. And she's late. And lo and behold, she finally drives up. She parks the car, but she parks it in the middle of the street with the engine running, the lights on, and leaves her door open. And she comes into the restaurant. I look, I say, Mom, Mama, what have you done? The car's out there. She's kind of, her pupils are dilated, something's going on. So I find out that she'd climbed the tree. And beneath her were this stack of hippies who were smoking away. And so my mother was secondary high when she came to the thing. It was the funniest damn thing I've ever seen in my life. So I had to go out and, park the car, shut the door, turn it off. It's great family folklore to this day. But she was the head of the health committee in Groton, Massachusetts. She started recycling in the community. She started a nature path and walk in Virginia at the school that I went to when I lived in Washington, when my father was at the State Department. So she just was always showing by example that you got to make a difference. And she's a huge part of my deep environmental commitment, which I've had all my life as a lieutenant governor, as a senator, and as a secretary of state.